You can't believe everything you see in here now, can you?
You know, it's really hard to believe everything you read.
In September of 1991, Smells Like Teen Spirit propelled Nirvana into one of the biggest bands of the decade. But the next year would prove that fame created as many problems as it solved. The press was inundated with stories of infighting within the band, manipulation outside the band, and at the center of it all, one man, Kurt Cobain. Already, his name was far outshining that of Nirvana, as story after story came out of drug use, outbursts, and threats. Kurt understood he needed to make a change. On August 4th, 1992, he checked himself into the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles for what would hopefully be his final detox, in anticipation of his daughter's birth. Just days later, his wife, Courtney Love, would follow suit with her own fears of a relapse. And as the couple received treatment in separate wings of the hospital, newsstands around the country filled with copies of September's Vanity Fair, featuring a controversial interview with the Cobains. On August 18th, Kurt was stirred awake by the panicked screams of Courtney at his door, and in a few hours, their efforts would pay off with the birth of a healthy baby girl, Frances Bean Cobain. Their joy would be short-lived. The very next day, a social worker visited the family holding a copy of September's Vanity Fair, and just a few weeks later, that same magazine was used as evidence in a court of law that Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love were unfit parents. It was as he reeled from losing custody of his daughter that Kurt would perform one of the biggest concerts of his career at the Reading Festival. As August of 1992 wound down and the band approached the one-year anniversary of Smells Like Teen Spirit, it was anyone's guess where they would be another year later. This was due in part to those old tensions within the band. Kurt had at one point been closer to bassist Krist Novoselic than anyone, and enjoyed many late nights with his old roommate and Nirvana drummer, Dave Grohl. But fame had given the band enough money to afford their own apartments hundreds of miles away from each other, and drugs had caused a rift in Krist and Kurt's relationship so wide that the bassist was essentially barred from Cobain's wedding. That is, at least until the Vanity Fair piece. We all rallied together, and it was cool. That's when things really turned around. Things hit rock bottom, but they rebounded. I think they appreciated that people came to their side. In February of the next year, Kurt agreed to give interviews for an official Nirvana biography, with the hopes that it might help restore the band's public image. In it, he spoke of heroin, the drug that defined much of the conversation around him, in the past tense, telling writer Michael Azerrad that, "I was able to be a successful junkie for a year, but if I kept going, I would eventually completely f*** my body up and ruin every relationship that I had and lose everything. I'd lose my friends and my family and all my money, everything, if I kept doing it." Perhaps it was Kurt's sobriety, as well as the bad press, that brought the band back together, as not long after giving his last interviews for the Nirvana biography, Kurt would meet his band in Minnesota to begin work on a third studio album. Nirvana likely had hundreds of reasons for choosing the North Star State for their base of operations, but none more important than producer Steve Albini. Producers love the Midwest, I guess. Albini already had a storied career in the underground, working with bands like Big Black and Pixies, with a sound that Kurt thought could define the next Nirvana album. Exactly the same sound that I have been carrying in my head since the beginning of this band. The feeling was not mutual. Albini was very open before, at the time, and since the collaboration about his indifference for Nirvana, explaining that he didn't think they were anything special. But at the end of the day, that's part of what got him to sign the contract. In a way, I felt sorry for them, the position they were in. There were a bunch of bigwig music industry scum whose fortunes depended on Nirvana making hit records. They were basically punk rock fans. They're people that were in a band that came up from an independent scene, and it was sort of a fluke that they got famous. Ultimately, Albini understood that Nirvana just wanted to get back to their roots. Nevermind, being the first of the band's albums released under the looming shade of the mighty Geffen umbrella, was a big, powerful album with lots of label interference. This next one would be different. Scaled back in every way, recorded in 2 weeks on a relatively shoestring budget, live with all the band playing together. The greatest change came from that sound in Kurt Cobain's head. The vague magic touch that the frontman only ever heard elsewhere in certain Steve Albini productions actually had a very simple execution. We used a lot of microphones. No later than the 2 weeks originally planned, Nirvana flew back home essentially with a finished album. The first, and arguably most important, step of their comeback year went off without a hitch. But anyone close to the band knew that it would be their next decision that would make or break the experiment. Because for as mentally challenging as recording a follow-up to one of the most successful albums of 1991 and 1992 must have been for Cobain, a nationwide tour may just topple that physically. For much of his adult life, Kurt suffered from a mysterious stomach condition, one seemingly aggravated by stress, but often spurred by nothing, which at best made him feel even more irritable than he was known for, and at worst, left him keeled over on the bathroom floor contemplating suicide. It was actually the severity of this condition which, in part, drove him to start using heroin in the first place. However, in recent months, with the discovery of a not yet FDA-approved miracle cure and a surprisingly comfortable home life considering the custody battle and Courtney love, Kurt started to feel a little better. But it was a fragile arrangement, with the turbulent subject of hitting the road especially giving the artist pause, as he jumped between telling interviewers that "I'm totally excited to tour" and "the only way we could tour is if I could find some way to keep my stomach from acting up." Either way, plans were made for a 4-month jaunt across North America, with punk mainstay Pat Smear being hired as second guitarist to take some pressure off Kurt on stage. With the tour now scheduled to begin just weeks after the release of the band's third studio album in September of 1993. And though the title of that album had been successfully whittled down from "I Hate Myself and Want to Die" to verse, chorus, verse to the obvious best choice, In Utero, work on the album itself was far from over. Rumors quickly began to swirl in the many months between the recording and release of In Utero that the execs over at Geffen were not happy, with demands apparently being made for a total remix. Producer Steve Albini was of the opinion that these rumors stemmed from the label themselves, trying to shake the band's confidence, while Cobain seemed to imply that the accusations came from none other than Steve Albini. Basically, the whole media thing was an ego boost for him, a way for him to get out of the fact that he had anything to do with us. He's so into being Mr. Punk Rock, it didn't surprise me. Regardless, these rumors were easily disproved. While it's true that many people inside Geffen did not approve of the album, that really didn't matter since Nirvana had total creative freedom baked into their contract. And while the band did hire R.E.M. producer Scott Litt to remix 2 songs, his influence was restrained. It was Nirvana's album through and through. As the September release date quickly approached, the band took on almost as many interviews as they did before Nevermind, once again making them the talk of the town. And though much of the discussion centered around the same old topics, another question cropped up almost as often. What do you expect from In Utero? With the answer often boiling down to, not much. Novoselic would admit that there are no teen spirits on In Utero. There are 6 or 7 great songs, but no phenomenal big hit. Albini, famously no great fan of Nirvana's hits, would still basically agree. Everything that they do for the rest of their careers is going to be secondary to what they've done up until now. Not secondary in quality, but secondary in impact. To which Kurt would add that we're certain that we won't sell a quarter as much, and we're totally comfortable with that because we like this record so much. It was all very kumbaya, very humble, but perhaps that was all to mask the dreadful reality of what was writing on In Utero. A question best explored by Cobain's last quote in Michael Lazarat's biography. "It's too bad, because I spent almost all the money I made off Nevermind fighting for my child because of the insane rumors created by the media, and now I don't have anything to live off of for the rest of my life. If this record doesn't sell, I'm not going to be set for life. I'm going to have to get a job in 10 years. Thankfully, all these concerns would be put to bed on September 13th, 1993, when In Utero first hit store shelves, not only to incredible reviews, but astonishing sales, reaching 5 million records sold just 2 months after Nevermind did, proving that even if lightning doesn't strike the same place twice, it can get pretty damn close. It was a turn of fate that seemed to mimic the good fortune surrounding the band as they entered 1994. Krist Novoselic was learning to use his newfound wealth and influence to encourage social change, organizing a protest that would eventually help repeal Washington's erotic music bill, and starting the Balkan Women's Aid Fund to support victims of the brutal Yugoslav wars. Dave Grohl's ambitions weren't quite so large. Always seen as the humblest in Nirvana's crew, his efforts were put towards an imminent wedding to his fiancée, a thriving reunion with his old band Scream, and maybe even a college degree. Even Pat Smear seemed to be settling well into the band. When pressed on if he'd stick around, most members gave the same sort of "I don't know" answer, but that wasn't for a lack of gratitude. Kurt even called him one of his best friends, explaining that "I look over and I see Pat's smiling face, and it just gives me a bit of hope, you know? Makes me feel good." A quote that Dave Grohl would mimic years later after performing in a different band with Smear. Of course, that only leaves one member without mention, Kurt Cobain, who, surprisingly, seemed to be doing better than anyone. Just going off of interviews from the time and the band's only official biography, he was at an all-time high. He was sober. After years of heavy drug use and a brief stint dabbling with the worst of the worst, he finally found it in himself to quit cold turkey. His stomach pain was all but vanquished as he confidently told MTV, it's gone. He even had the perfect nuclear family he'd always wanted. The same one that was ripped from him at age 9 when his parents divorced was found in the loving home he'd built with his wife Courtney. And after months of battling, he'd even gotten his daughter back permanently. He had everything he could ever want. But Kurt Cobain took his own life on April 5th, 1994, leaving most everyone, from the casual MTV viewer to the most studied and informed fans, dumbstruck. In his last Rolling Stone interview, taken in October of 1993, he explained how "I've been relieved of so much pressure in the last year and a half. Pulling this record off, my family, my child, just little things that no one would recognize or care about. And it has a lot to do with this band. If it wasn't for this band, those things never would have happened. I'm really thankful. And every month I come to more optimistic conclusions. How could a man who seemed to have it all do this to himself?" It's simple. He lied. Let's take a step back. The official story was that Kurt Cobain checked into the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in early August, experienced some of the worst pain of his life as he detoxed, and was fully rehabilitated in time to hold his daughter in his own arms, essentially shutting the book on the drug chapter. This wasn't true. The day after Frances was born, Kurt and Courtney received a copy of September's Vanity Fair, and the couple quickly understood that this would spell trouble for their family. But it was Kurt who thought it could permanently end their family. So he escaped from the hospital and came back with a loaded pistol and some heroin. Without getting too deep into the details, the pistol plan did not work out, but Kurt had thoroughly backslid into his drug addiction. Thankfully, the same court order that eventually took Frances away also forced Kurt into a 30-day rehab, and though he would mock this decision as redundant to the press, he would once again be forced to detox just days after the worst detox of his life. This one, at least, would stick, long enough for Kurt to fight back custody of his daughter and record a new Nirvana album. And while what I said earlier about the band rallying around Kurt as the whole world seemed to be coming down on top of him is true, the extent to which they rallied may have been exaggerated. Nirvana came together to record an album, but once they were done, they were done. They all went back to their own lives. By the summer of 1993, Kurt was back into the routine of using heroin every day, so much so that the once uniquely traumatizing experience of finding him overdosed became commonplace, with the 2001 biography Heavier Than Heaven positing that it may have happened as many as a dozen times during 1993 alone. In September of that year, In Utero released to wide acclaim. It was a time that should have brought a great big sigh of relief, but there is still one major question left unanswered. Would the band tour? And while in earlier interviews Kurt seemed open to the idea, he spent much of September fighting passionately to stay off the road. This put him at odds with just about everyone, not only because tours make a lot of money, but because they can significantly boost an album's sales. Which I guess is also an argument for money. But hey, money's important, especially to Kurt, whose turbulent life meant that he'd need all the cash he could get before an inevitable breakup or lawsuit. So Cobain agreed to a 4-month arena tour of North America, bringing in Pat Smear to take some pressure off him. And believe me, the pressure was mounting. In November, Nirvana agreed to perform as part of MTV's Unplugged program, where artists and bands from across the musical spectrum performed in a stripped-down acoustic styling. It was an environment that called for restraint, poise, and calm, something which Nirvana was not quite known for. Kurt was nervous, especially since he was dealing with some pretty bad withdrawals. It fell on some poor, unfortunate intern at MTV to find Cobain some Valium to get him through the worst of it, while the man himself gave the heartbreaking request that all the people who love me sit in the front. I'm scared. It was pushing past these fears and anxieties that Kurt sat on that stage. He had relied for so much of his career on the energy of the crowd and the distortion of the speakers to guide him through each performance. But as he began to strum his guitar, the crowd was deathly quiet. He played on, hardly saying a word until after the third song of the set, though even that was to warn that,
I guarantee you I will screw this song up.
Of course, stated before the man who sold the world, likely the greatest cover of any song possibly ever. Just classic Kurt. By the end of the gig, it's clear his spirits were significantly higher than they were prior, though he refused to celebrate. As the rest of Nirvana and everyone in their circle enjoyed the show's after-party, Kurt left the building with his friend Amy Finnerty. All night he had ducked praise and refused compliments, but as they stood together in the elevator, he couldn't help but admit the obvious. I was really f***ing good tonight, wasn't I? Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, Kurt was suffering with more than just withdrawals in his dressing room. His stomach pain was back, and with it came feelings that Cobain had wrestled with for much of his life. It's no big secret that mental illness ran in Kurt's family. At least, not these days. For years, it was discussed only in whispers that Kurt's great-grandfather had taken his own life in a mental institute, a secret that would have likely been discussed much more openly when his great-uncle followed suit in 1978. Kurt would have likely gone his whole life hearing about such tragedies in his family, leading him to often joke about suicide in his best moments and threaten it at his worst. The later months of 1993 were definitely on the negative side, with his stomach pain already being a subject that left him feeling hopeless in the past, and his struggles with addiction only deepening these feelings. Journal entries from this time find Kurt wrestling with a certain level of shame. Though he had spent much of the past few months fighting with those closest to him over his drug use, balking at the idea that he should quit, it's clear there was a part of him that wanted to, or at the very least, a part that didn't want to be addicted. I don't want my daughter to grow up and someday be hassled by kids at school. I don't want people telling her that her parents were junkies. Nirvana entered 1994 with only a few dates left on their North American tour, but this would not be a year of rest and relaxation. Just that next month, they'd be packing up again and flying to France for the beginnings of a third headlining tour of Europe, a continent that had spelled trouble for Nirvana in the past. Both of the band's previous headlining tours, in 1989 and 1991, were ended early due to exhaustion. And this time, instead of being propelled by the excitement of their first performances out of country or the promotion of their first major label album, they'd be playing for the simple and honest desire to get paid. As you'd imagine, this was not a very motivating goal to a group of millionaires, especially not Kurt Cobain. By now, he was a daily user of heroin, and not only was it harder to score thousands of miles away from his nearest dealer, it was also a genuine concern whether he'd get caught with something at one of the tour's many border crossings. He was thankfully able to sidestep any withdrawals with the help of some phony prescriptions from dirty doctors, but these were mild solutions to a major problem. Kurt was dependent on heroin because of how it affected his mood, and without the drug, his morale began to fall considerably. Those touring with the frontman began to note a change in his demeanor near the end of February. He was more distant, quiet, he could be heard arguing on the phone with someone before shows, and overall, there was an air of hopelessness around him. No one quite grasped what was wrong with Kurt until the night of Nirvana's last concert. The Melvins were opening. Not only were they Kurt's favorite band in high school, they had been close friends of his throughout much of his life, especially frontman Buzz Osborne. As the Melvins made their way off stage and Nirvana prepared to go on stage, Kurt shared a few words with Buzz. He told him that he was going to fire his management, break up the band, and divorce Courtney. By now, the only other person in the world who knew of these plans was Kurt's lawyer. Buzz was likely still in shock when Kurt walked away. I should just be doing this solo, he concluded. In retrospect, Buzz recognized. He was talking about his entire life. After the show, Kurt told his agent to cancel the tour. He phoned one of his many dirty doctors who essentially wrote up a sick note. The tour was officially delayed, and Kurt took off for Rome, where he would be seeing his wife for the first time in almost a month. Love herself had been very busy in 1994. Her first major label album, Holes Live Through This, was scheduled for release that April. So while Kurt explored the city, stealing romantic gifts like a Vatican candlestick and a piece of the Roman Colosseum, Courtney was doing press in England. When she did arrive late that night, she found Kurt ready for a hot date, when all she wanted was some rest and relaxation. And why not? The two would have days to spend together, doing whatever the hell they wanted before Kurt had to leave and finish his tour. What was so special about that night? Courtney went to bed without an answer. But when she woke up the next day, her husband was not in bed next to her. He was on the floor, fully dressed, and pale as chalk. In his hand was a note. Later that day, CNN reported that Kurt Cobain had died of a drug overdose. Apparently, Courtney herself had called Nirvana's label telling them that he'd passed. But within the next hour, as the news somehow leaked out and spread to the whole world, it was revealed to be a hoax. The truth is, Kurt did overdose, and he did die. Both things that had happened before, though never as seriously as they had then. After being rushed to the hospital, his stomach was pumped and he was revived, though comatose. As the hoax was disproved, good news spread throughout the Nirvana camp. Kurt had been a little reckless that night in Rome and mixed some pills with some alcohol, and everyone sighed a breath of relief. Everyone except for Courtney, one of the few people who read the note in Kurt's hand. Like Hamlet, I have to choose between life and death. I'm choosing death. Though not exactly organized, the note touched on many subjects that informed his decision. His distaste for touring, his belief that Courtney no longer loved him, and a formal accusation that his wife was cheating on him with her old boyfriend, Billy Corgan. I'd rather die than go through another divorce, he concluded. The next day, Kurt awoke from his coma in no better spirits. He returned to Seattle as soon as the hospital let him, and quickly got back into heroin. Courtney tried to curb this, instating a rule that no drugs could be done in their home. But all that did was drive her husband onto the streets. The next few weeks would be a total mess. It became harder and harder to reach Kurt, both emotionally and literally, as he was almost never home. It was around this time that Krist Novoselic tried to reconnect with Kurt. Despite the fact that, in his own words, the band was broken up, Novoselic couldn't help but feel bad for his old friend. After an intervention a year prior only furthered the gap between Kurt and everyone else, Krist warned Cobain about a planned do-over on March 21st, and it was canceled. Instead, Nirvana's bassist attempted to use the goodwill he earned from telling the truth to attempt a sort of Hail Mary, offering to forget about all the drugs, the rehabs, the contracts, even Nirvana, and go on vacation. Just the two of them. Kurt was quiet after that. He didn't want to go. Instead, they decided to take a trip to the local Jack in the Box for a simple meal. But when they arrived, it was clear Kurt was only there for a drug deal. This obviously triggered an argument, but nothing Novoselic was saying actually made a dent. Cobain just walked away. That next Friday, on March 25th, Kurt broke Courtney's big rule and got high in his own bedroom. The timing couldn't be worse, as when he walked downstairs, he was met with a living room full of the most important people in his life. It was another intervention, and this time, they all came with ultimatums. Janet Billig, Danny Goldberg, and John Silva from Kurt's management company Gold Mountain said that they would cut ties with him. Gary Gersh and Mark Cates from Geffen Records said the label would drop him. Pat Smear from Nirvana said that the band would break up. And Courtney Love, his wife, said that she would divorce him. If, and only if, he refused treatment. Kurt was furious, seemingly less for the suddenness and gravity of their confrontation, and more for their shared hypocrisy. These were people whom he'd known for years, all with vices that he'd seen time and time again, especially his wife. Courtney had fully backslid into her own drug dependency in recent months, and Kurt refused to heed the warnings of someone who was arguably in the same position as him. That's when the second bombshell dropped. Courtney would be going to rehab in Los Angeles. She wanted him to come with her. There was a car waiting outside to take them both to the airport. She extended her hand and begged him to take it. But he didn't even look at her. It was the last time they'd ever speak in person. I did not even kiss or get to say goodbye to my husband. That weekend brought the bender to end all benders. Kurt hit the town, doing everything and anything. He shared syringes and OD'd, only surviving each brush with death by pure happenstance. By Monday, he was home again. Only this time, it was empty. Somehow, he convinced himself to call a psychiatrist, and somehow, he convinced himself to listen to what the doctor had to say. The next day, arrangements were made for Kurt to try rehab one more time. And the person driving him to the airport was none other than Krist Novoselic. Who knows what convinced him to try and help his old friend again. But he'd regret it soon enough. As soon as they stepped into the airport, Kurt punched Krist in the face and tried to run away. A crowd formed as the two brawled like angry drunks, and when Kurt finally slipped away for good, he spit out the only goodbye he could muster. "Fuck you." It was the last thing he ever said to his old best friend. Kurt again returned home, and again spoke to his psychiatrist. And somehow he was convinced to book another flight to Los Angeles the next day. As unlikely as it seems, this struggle was an internal one as much as it was external. Kurt didn't want to be addicted to heroin anymore. He hated having so little control over his mind and body. Yet somehow, at every turn, he just couldn't take that final decisive step to clean himself up. As confident as he may have sounded when he wrote that note in Rome, when he claimed to have chosen death over life, it's clear that a part of him still wanted to live. The next day, Kurt bought a 20-gauge shotgun and hid it somewhere only he could find it. Then he packed his things and took a town car to the airport. On March 31st, 1994, Cobain began treatment at the Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles. The place was popular with rock stars, and Kurt was lucky enough to be receiving treatment at the same time as the Butthole Surfers' Gibby Haynes. They quickly hit it off, as much as they could, on that first day at least. For obvious reasons, Cobain was feeling less than social coming off the worst bender of his life. The next day, however, on April 1st, his mood seemed to have shifted completely. The Cobain's nanny, Jackie Ferry, visited with Francis and noted how positive he seemed in spite of his circumstances. He laughed and smiled and even complimented Jackie's idea for a TV show. All the while he cradled his daughter. Francis was his pride and joy. He had spent so much of the last year and a half fighting for this moment, fighting just for the right to hold his own daughter in his arms. Despite everything, there was still no one he loved more in the whole world than Francis. When the time came for the visit to end, Jackie promised to visit again tomorrow. But Kurt knew better. He looked his daughter in the eyes and said goodbye, knowing it would be for the last time. That afternoon, Kurt Cobain and Gibby Haynes shared a cigarette on the back patio of the Exodus Recovery Center. Ahead of them was a wall. It reminded Gibby of a story. An old friend of his had checked into Exodus once a long time ago, but changed his mind. In the middle of the night, he climbed the wall and ran away, only to later learn that the doors in the front were unlocked. Kurt laughed. For the past 2 days, Courtney had been trying to reach her husband. She called him over and over and over, never quite reaching him when he was near the phone. But that night, she got lucky. He picked up, but only stayed for a little while. It sounded like he was in the middle of something, but when she asked for details, he didn't budge. Just remember, no matter what, I love you. Then he hung up, called a cab, and climbed the wall of the Exodus Recovery Center. He was home before anyone caught on. In the early morning of April 2nd, Kurt disappeared. He wouldn't be found for almost a week. And by then, it was too late. Kurt Cobain took his own life on April 5th, 1994. The sad little sensitive, unappreciative Pisces Jesus man. Why don't you just enjoy it? I don't know. I have a goddess of a wife who sweats ambition and empathy, and a daughter who reminds me too much of what I used to be, full of love and joy, kissing every person she meets because everyone is good and will do her no harm. And that terrifies me to the point where I can barely function. I can't stand the thought of Francis becoming the miserable, self-destructive death rocker that I've become. I have it good. Very good. And I'm grateful. But since the age of 7, I've become hateful towards all humans in general. Only because it seems so easy for people to get along and have empathy. Empathy! Only because I love and feel for people too much, I guess. Thank you all, from the pit of my burning, nauseous stomach, for your letters and concern during the past years. I'm too much of an erratic, moody baby. I don't have the passion anymore. And so remember, it's better to burn out than to fade away. On Sunday, April 10th, 1994, a candlelight vigil was held in Kurt's memory at the Seattle Center. In attendance were 7,000 fans and admirers of Cobain, who came to pay their respects while speakers played messages taped by Krist Novoselic and Courtney Love. They couldn't make it in person, as across town, they, along with all of Kurt's closest friends and family, gathered for a private memorial. At many points in the past 2 years, Cobain threatened to quit Nirvana. That, or fire everyone else in the band and move in a totally separate direction. These threats often came, as you'd expect, in the middle of arguments or at the end of long tours, but there were still many times when Kurt seemed to want a genuine change. I hate to actually even say it, but I can't see this band lasting more than a couple more albums unless we really work hard on experimenting. I mean, let's face it, when the same people are together doing the same job, they're limited. I'm really interested in studying different things, and I know Chris and Dave are as well, but I don't know if we are capable of doing it together. I don't want to put out another record that sounds like the last 3 records. Adding that, it's impossible for me to look into the future and say, I'm going to be able to play Nirvana songs in 10 years. There's no way. Despite this, Nirvana only officially disbanded after Kurt's death. There was never a shred of doubt that they would act otherwise. There was no Nirvana without Kurt. But life went on. Dave Grohl, Mr. I take pride in leading the most simple life of anybody in the band, started the Foo Fighters with Pat Smear, which quickly grew to be one of the biggest bands in the world, selling out arenas and propelling Dave into proper Hollywood, Super Bowl commercial, Jimmy Kimmel game-playing stardom. Krist Novoselic didn't take things quite so far. After Nirvana, he took part in a few musical projects, but broadly speaking stepped away from the spotlight. He is best known in recent decades for his political activism. Courtney Love's band Hole released Live Through This as scheduled on April 12, 1994. The timing had already been difficult before Kurt's death, as the stress of her home life would often have Love bursting into tears in the middle of promotional interviews, but that was only made worse after his passing. Questions were raised about her character, about her fitness as a mother, about her relationship with Cobain, the latter coming to define much of the conversation around Love since. And while Kurt obviously never could have challenged these accusations directly, he had plenty to say to people who believed he was a slave to his wife. It's such a fucking typical sexist stupid thing to say. So classic. At many points, Kurt believed he would outlive Nirvana. That one day, the band would fade into obscurity and he would be left with nothing more than memories of smashed guitars and roaring crowds. For better and for worse, he was wrong. Nirvana the band only survived Kurt Cobain by a few days. But Nirvana the idea, Nirvana the cultural touchstone of a forgotten generation and pioneers of a new era of popular music, that would never be forgotten.